Hello, hello. All right, here is the next video in our solving quadratic equation sequence. So as per usual, you'll need to make sure that you have your quarter folded piece of paper, as well as your printed copy of Solving Quadratics by Completing the Square Review. If you have both of those, then you are good to go. So let me go ahead and turn this around and share my screen. All right. So this is going to be the third piece of Solving Quadratic Equations review. This one is probably the most involved process. So there's going to be a lot of things that we need to write into this somewhat small space. So I just encourage you to use your best, tidiest, and smallest handwriting for this section. So this is number 3. And it is going to be complete the square. All right. So the steps are as follows. Step 1 is to move the x terms to the left side and constants to the right side. It doesn't necessarily have to be the left and right side, but that was just the easiest way that I could find to refer to which part of the equation I was talking about. Step 2, if the leading coefficient is not 1, then you need to factor it out. So factor out the leading coefficient. Because when we complete the square, the leading coefficient must be a 1. Step 3 then is to complete the square, which is a process in and of itself. So we're going to break it down into pieces. So step A, I'm going to call it, we need to write a blank on both sides. Step B is going to talk about how to fill out the left blank, meaning the blank that is on the side with the x terms. Here's what you're going to do, is you're going to take the middle term coefficient divide it by 2 and square it. So the left blank is filled in with the middle term coefficient divided by 2 and squared. The right blank is going to be filled in with the left blank, that's the number in the left blank, times the left leading coefficient. So that number that we factored out, you have to multiply it by the number in the blank and add it to the other side. I know that that's a lot of words, but it's kind of hard to describe in words what we're doing. If that seems confusing, I think the example on this one may be the most useful thing to reference, but I'm writing the steps in case that's more useful for you. Step 4 is to write the left side in factored form. Okay, this is the whole point of completing the square. If you forget to factor it, it was like, why did I even try to add stuff to both sides? The whole point is so that it gets factored, because then we can just solve it using a square root. If it's something that you can easily factor, then just go ahead and factor it. But if it's something that can't, for example, something that has fractions, this is how you fill it out. You're going to have a number, you're going to have something plus something else. This first blank thing is going to be whatever the variable is. So if you're dealing with x's or a's or b's, that's what's going to go there. And this blank over here is going to be the middle coefficient divided by 2. Okay, and then the last step is to solve for x, which typically we'll end up doing by taking the square root, so you can refer to the panel at the left. So there's the process. As you can see, a little more involved than the other processes we've outlined so far. And again, if that is confusing, I hope that this example will be a useful thing to have for you to have written down and to reference as you work on this on your own. So the example that we're going to do is 4x squared plus 24x plus 1 equals negative 19. So, step 1. If we look back up here, step 1 is to move the x terms to the left side and the constants to the right side. So, to do that, we would need to subtract 1 from both sides. So we subtract 1 from both sides, so we end up with 4x squared plus 24x equals negative 20. Step 2 then is if the leading coefficient is not 1, factor out the leading coefficient. So in our example here, our leading coefficient is in fact not a 1, so we need to factor it out. So we'll have x squared plus 6x equals negative 20. Okay. Step 3 then is to complete the square. So how we do that is we got to write a blank on both sides. So x squared plus 6x plus a blank equals negative 20 plus a blank. The left blank is going to be the middle term coefficient divided by 2 and squared. So we're going to take 6 divided by 2, square it, and that's what's going to go here. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, squared is 9. And then the right blank is the left blank times the left leading coefficient. So for this one, we're going to take the left blank, which is a 9, and we're going to multiply it by the left leading coefficient, which is a 4. So our blank is going to be 36. Now we've finished completing the square, so the next thing that we can do is write this in factored form. This one is one that you can factor, so if you prefer to use an X puzzle to figure it out, you can do that. Or the pattern that we see is the 4 comes along for the ride, and then we factor the thing in the parentheses by putting the variable first, and then we add the middle term divided by 2, which for this example is going to be 3. So we get 4 times x plus 3 squared equals, and then you can just go ahead and add those together. So 36 subtract 20 is a positive 16. Step 5 then is to solve for x. So to do that, we can divide by 4 on both sides. So we'll divide by 4, divide by 4. So we get x plus 3 squared equals 4. Once we're here, we can just go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus and minus. So we have x plus 3 equals positive or negative. The square root of 4 is 2. So then we can subtract 3 from both sides. And we end up with x equals negative 3 plus or minus 2. Negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. Negative 3 subtract 2 is negative 5. So at the end of the day, our solution here is 1 and negative 5. I know that was a lot of information, but hopefully breaking it down into those pieces is helpful to you. All right, so now that we have your graphic organizer filled out, let's go ahead and pull out your worksheet and work those first 4 example problems. So for this first one, we start by moving the x terms to the left side and the constants to the right. So for this, we need to add 51 to both sides. So we get x squared plus 14x equals 51. Then, if the leading coefficient is not a 1, we need to factor it out. Fortunately for us, the leading coefficient here is a 1, so we can go ahead and skip that step. Step 3 then is to complete the square. So we need to write a blank on each side. So we'll have x squared plus 14x plus a blank equals 51 plus a blank. The left blank is going to be 14 divided by 2 squared, which is going to be 7 squared, which is 49. The right blank is going to be that number times the leading coefficient, which unfortunately again is a 1. So we are going to end up with a 49 on both sides. Then at this point we need to factor, which again is the whole point of completing the squares so that we can factor this. So we would end up with our variable plus our middle term divided by 2, which is going to be a 7. So we get x plus 7 squared. The other side, 51 plus 49 is 100. Now, what we're going to do is solve for x. So we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. So you'll get x plus 7 equals positive and negative 10. Since the square root of 100 is 10. Subtract 7 from both sides. We get x equals negative 7 plus or minus 10. Negative 7 plus 10 is a positive 3. Negative 7 subtract 10 is a negative 17. So our solution to this problem is 3 and negative 17. All right, number 2. The first thing that we need to do is get the x terms on one side and the constants on the other. So we'll add 91 to both sides. So we end up with x squared minus 4x equals 98. Step 2 then is if the leading coefficient is not a 1, factor out the leading coefficient. Fortunately for us it is a 1, so we can move to step 3, which is to complete the square. To do so, we need to write a blank on both sides. So we'll have x squared minus 4x plus something equals 98 plus something. The left blank, we're going to take our middle number, which is a negative 4. If it's a negative, you need to make sure that you bring the negative down. you're going to divide that by 2 and square it. -4 divided by 2 is -2. -2 squared is 4. To fill in the right blank, we take that number and multiply it by our leading coefficient, which for this one was a 1. So we end up adding 4 to both sides. Now, step 4 is the whole point of completing the square, which means we're going to factor it. So we do our variable, and then we're going to add that number divided by 2, that middle term divided by 2. So we have -4 divided by 2, which is -2. So I guess instead of adding, you're going to subtract 2 since that number is negative. So I have x minus 2 squared equals 98 plus 4, which is 102. Now our final step is just go ahead and solve. So we can take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So we get x minus 2 equals positive and negative square root of 102. We can add 2 to both sides. So we end up with x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 102. And then we'll just want to make sure that our radical doesn't simplify. 101 divided by 2 is 51 and 2. 51 is prime. So since it does not simplify, we know that that is our final solution. All right, number 3. So again, we need to move the the x terms to the left side and the constants to the right. So let's go ahead and subtract 8x from both sides. So we end up with 2x squared subtract 8x equals -6. If the leading coefficient on the left side is not 1, factor out the leading coefficient. So we'll factor out a 2 here. So we'll have x squared minus 4x equals -6. And then we're going to go ahead and complete this square. So we'll do 2 times x squared minus 4x plus our blank equals -6 plus something. To figure out what goes in the blank, we take our middle number, divide it by 2, and square it. So -4 divided by 2 is -2, squared is 4. The number that goes on the other side is going to be the left blank, which is 4, times the leading coefficient, which is 2. So this side, we're going to add 8. Our fourth step then is to write the left side in factored form. So the 2 is going to come along for the ride. We're going to take our variable. We're going to take our middle term and divide it by 2, which is -2. Square that, and that's going to be equal to -6 plus 8, which is a +2. Then we can go ahead and divide by 2 on both sides. So we end up with x minus 2 squared equals 1. Square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. X minus 2 equals the positive or -1. Add 2 to both sides. We end up with x equals 2 plus or minus 1, which we can go ahead and do. 2 plus 1 is 3, and 2 minus 1 is 1. So our final solution to this one is 3 and +1. All right, and the final example for this video, number 4. Oh, sorry, zoomed in a little much there. Okay, so step 1 is to move the x terms to the left side and the constants to the right side. So we'll add 12x to both sides. So we'll have 4x squared plus 12x. And then we also want to move the constants to the other side. So we'll have 47 over here, because that goes to 0 and that goes to 0. Okay, step 2, if the leading coefficient on the left side is not 1, factor out the leading coefficient. So our leading coefficient is a 4, so we'll factor that out. So we have x squared plus 3x equals 47. Next thing we do is complete the square. So to do that, we want to go ahead and insert our little blank. So we have x squared plus 3x plus the number that completes the square equals 47 plus a number. To fill in this blank, we're going to take 3, divide that. We're going to take 3, divide it by 2, and square it. That doesn't divide nicely, so we're going to need to square the fraction. When you square a fraction, you square both the numerator and the denominator. So our blank is going to be 9 over 4. When we fill in the blank on the other side, we're going to take the number that we used to complete the square and multiply it by our leading coefficient. So for this one, that's going to be 9 over 4 times 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1, so all we need to add to the right side is 9. Step 4 is to write the left side in factored form, which is the whole point of completing the square. So we rejoice in that step because it makes it a lot easier to solve. So our variable is x, and then we're going to add our middle coefficient divided by 2 and square that. So we'll have 4 times x plus 3/2 squared is equal to 47 plus 49, 47 plus 9, which is 56. From there, we can go ahead and divide both sides by 4. So we get x plus 3/2 squared equals 56 divided by 4, which is 14. We can take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So we get x plus 3/2 equals the positive and negative square root of 14. And then the final thing that we need to do to solve for x is subtract 3/2 from both sides. So we get x equals negative 3/2 plus or minus the square root of 14. Before we can say that's our final answer, we got to check and make sure that the square root of 14 doesn't simplify. 2 and 7 are prime, so that's the end there. So that is, in fact, the solution to this quadratic equation. All right, so that's the 4 examples for this video. On your assignment, there are an additional 4 examples, some with a leading coefficient of 1 and some without. As per usual, the answers are on the back, so you can use those to make sure you're doing it correct. If you are not getting the correct answers, make sure you go back and see if you can identify your error. And as always, if you have any questions or if there's anything that you're struggling with, please let me know and I'd be happy to help.